So hello everyone and welcome again to Introduction to Criminal Justice. Today's topic is release and reentry. Right? So after a prisoner has completed their sentence or has been paroled, what does it look like? So we'll begin with full release and parole. At the federal level, right? So we're talking the federal offenses, federal prisons. Offenders generally serve approximately 85% of their sentence before they are fully released. Right? This occurs for several reasons. So there are programming incentives, things called good time, and issues with overcrowding. So 85% is what you generally have to, is generally what you're going to need. But programming incentives, so let's say that drugs contributed to your crime. If you complete the prison's drug treatment program, right, the drug counseling program, they will knock time off of your sentence, right? So it's incentive for you to complete the programs. Same thing is true for GED programs, sometimes college programs. The idea is these things are trying to make you a better person. They are trying to rehabilitate you. And we want to encourage you to be rehabilitated instead of just incapacitated. So we will knock time off of your sentence. Now, at the federal level, this is really important. The states have this too, but it's especially important at the federal level. And we'll talk about why in a second. There's this concept of good time. So, right, we know prisons are dangerous places. They're very difficult on everyone involved. And so it's easy for people to want to lash out, right? You have nothing better to do besides like harass the guards or beat up people or whatever. We want to give you incentive to not do that, right? So every day, generally speaking, that you go without an infraction of the rules, we give you a little bit of extra credit, right? So it may be every day that you go out breaking the rules, you get 1 day and a 1/12 of a day off your or towards your sentence, right? So you've served 1 day of your sentence, and now we're giving you a 1/12 of a day extra, right? And that adds up, especially if you're in prison for a long time, off of your sentence. Now, good time is interesting because it's something that prison officials like and offenders like, but prison officials especially like it because it allows them to have greater control over inmates. So just because you earn good time, so let's say that you've been in prison for 3 years and you have maybe 6 months gets knocked off your sentence, right? Because of good time, because you followed the rules. If you end up breaking a rule, right, the prison officials can take away some or even all of your good time, right? So the idea here is we want you to be consistently good. If you do very well for a long time and then you mess up, everything that you did could be all for naught, right? So we want offenders to be kind of on their and understand the full repercussions, because nobody wants to be in prison longer than they have to be. So if there's a way to get out of it, they're going to get out of it. And then the other kind of issue that comes up with 85% is the notion of overcrowding. So federal prisons, this isn't as bad, but in state prisons, it is definitely bad overcrowding. So it's so bad, in fact, that California, for the past several years, has been under court order to release a ridiculous number of its prisoners, because you have a 10 by 10 cell with 6 people in it, right? It's inhumane conditions, and the courts have ordered that people be released. Now, this is kind of an ad hoc determination, but that there are certain percentages and thresholds that have to be met. Now, these things are very important, right? Programming, good time, and overcrowding, because the feds, especially, have all but eliminated parole, right? So we'll talk about what parole is, but generally speaking, parole is you serve a certain part of your sentence, and then you get to serve the rest of your sentence out in the community, right? We let you out of prison, you're still under kind of the thumb of the correctional system, but you're no longer in a prison setting. Now, the feds have not completely, but basically eliminated parole, right, in favor of programming, incentives, and good time. So it's difficult to get parole at the federal level, because if you do good, you're never going to get to that threshold where you'll be considered for parole. And now what we're seeing is that more and more states are following the feds, and they're eliminating parole, right? So a release, you're still under the thumb of the justice system, but you're not in prison. That being said, short of a full release, right, and if eligible, parole allows offenders to serve the final portion of their sentence in the community. So one thing that gets confused a lot is parole and probation. So parole is a condition of release, right? Whereas probation is a sentence. So what do we mean by this kind of like weird distinction, right? So the two share a lot of similarities, and both may be implicated in a single sentence, right? So parole is, we're releasing you, but you're still under the thumb of the justice system until your sentence has been fulfilled, right, in terms of years, months, or whatever. So parole, it's a condition of release. You have to abide by certain rules, certain things, etc. Whereas probation is a sentence, right? Parole, you were sentenced to prison and you get out. It's a condition of release. Probation is a sentence, right? So you may be sentenced directly to probation. That being said, a lot of times you will be sentenced, especially at the federal level, to X number of years in prison, followed by X number of years on probation, right? So it's still a part of the sentence. Now, the two share many similarities, and can be implicated in a single sentence, right? So one thing that the feds do a lot is they will say there's a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, right? And with good time, programming, incentives, blah, 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 you might be able to get out in 4 years, right? If that's a full release. You may also get paroled, right? Where we say, we're going to let you out of prison, but you have to follow these conditions and yada, yada, yada. you break that parole and you're violated, you return to prison. Probation is a separate sentence, right? So what it looks like is you are sentenced to 5 years in prison and 5 years on probation, right? So it's different than parole, right? Parole is the condition of release. Probation is the sentence, right? So you can be sentenced directly to probation, or we at the federal level like to split it and say 5 years imprisonment, 5 years on probation. They share many similarities, and like I said, they can be implicated in a single sentence. So at the federal level, you may be able to, or the state level especially, qualify for parole, but then you also have to meet the threshold of probation. So how do we determine parole, right? If, and this is an if, an offender is eligible for parole, and this is generally based on the offense, right? So the more severe the offense, the less likely it is they're going to be eligible for parole. Generally speaking, after the offender completes 2/3 of their sentence, this is at the federal level, their file may be reviewed by a parole board. Now, you are not entitled to parole as a matter of right. Instead, you have to actively seek out and submit a petition to the parole board for review. Now, functionally, the parole board has several things that it's responsible for, right? So first, the parole board functionally selects and places prisoners on parole, right? That makes sense, right? The parole board decides who goes on parole and who doesn't, right? The parole board also provides continuing control over the parolees in the community. So we set conditions on parole, right? So you have to check in with your parole officer once a week, or you have to do drug testing once a week, or something along those lines, right? So we still have control over you, even though you are no longer in jail. They also deal with discharges of parolees when a sentence is completed. So if we abide by the sentence and you finish it out, the parole board ends your period of incarceration, ends your period of probation, and you are officially done with the incarceration part of your sentence. In addition, parole boards review parole violations, and they determine when revocation and return to prison is appropriate, right? So parole boards, it's very similar to probation, right? You have to do all kinds of things like drug testing and checking in and maybe ankle monitoring, I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? And let's say you violate one of the terms of your parole. If you violate one of the terms of your parole, it does not necessarily mean that you're going back to prison, right? So your parole officer can violate you, and then the parole board determines whether or not you should return to prison or whether he can give you a second chance, right? And really, it just depends on how long you've been on it, how well you've done, what was the mistake that you made. Was it like a really big thing, or was it like you were an hour late to a meeting? You know, and you know, there is room for understanding there. So they review parole violations and determine whether or not you have to go back to prison, right? So we can always revoke parole. Now, the efficacy of parole boards varies greatly. So Massachusetts, and this is a really interesting topic if you're ever interested in it, had a very big scandal Actually, I believe the former governor served a jail sentence. At least some representatives did serve a jail sentence. Um, it was a kind of a quid pro quo. So basically, what happened is um, parole boards get appointed in different ways. Sometimes it's by the governor, sometimes it's by a commission, what have you. And what happened is in Massachusetts, um, the governor and the parole and basically the justice system in Massachusetts appointed people to the parole board who were very good friends or relatives to the governor, right? I mean, like that's all it was. Um, these people weren't necessarily qualified. There were questions of bribery. I mean, there's all kinds of big issues that happened in the Massachusetts parole board scandal. So it's problematic, right? In the sense that that the efficacy, it really just depends state by state, and the oversight that we put on to parole boards. So let's talk about the parole board hearing, right? So parole board hearings are generally conducted in private with minimum due process protections afforded to the inmates within the discretion of the board. Right, so the board gets to set the rules as to what the inmates can do, can't do, say, can't say, bring in, can't bring in, etc. Right, the parole board has like really, really significant control, and you have minimum due process, right? Because you're in prison. There is very little due process. You have some, you have to have some, but very little due process. Now, generally what happens during a hearing is the parole board will review the original case, right? So they'll review the evidence, they'll review the testimony, etc. At this point, the exclusionary rule does not apply. So they can review evidence that never came into evidence at trial because it was excluded for violating the Constitution. The parole board will look at an inmate's post-conviction activities. So did the inmate take active steps to better themselves in terms of taking vocational classes? Were they good, right? Did they violate the rules? Did they join a gang? You know, what did they do, right? And that's a very big one, right? Is you know, did you try to help yourself, or were you just there and playing the politics of prison? That being said, with minimum due process rights, the inmate is given a chance to be heard on why parole is appropriate. So the inmate has to make the case of why they deserve to be let out of prison early to finish their sentence in the community, right? And the burden is really on them to show this. So they are given a chance to be heard. Now we are going to watch in a minute Charles Manson, some of his parole board hearings. They are very wild, but they're given and you'll see he's given a chance to talk, right, and explain himself. And he, I mean, he's passed away now, but he was very much he lost his mind, and you'll see why in a minute. So again, they have to be heard. Now, the victim is generally given a chance to be heard regarding parole, right? So the victim or the victim's family is generally given a chance. So Generally speaking, the victim has to be notified if an offender is coming up for parole, and they have to be allowed the opportunity to speak if they want to. They don't have to. They don't even have to show up. And a lot of times they don't, right? They want to put it past them. They want to move on, whatever. So they're given opportunity to speak. And what they say is very, very important because if, and this happens actually a lot more frequently than you would think, oftentimes the victim will say that they have forgiven the offender and they think the offender should be released. Right? And it's something that like you don't expect them to say, but it happens a lot more than you would think. So they have the opportunity to be heard, and they can say the other thing, like, and a lot of times it's just repeating to the parole board what this person did to them, what it did to their life, how it hurt them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And generally speaking, the harder the victim fights, the more likely it is that they're probably not going to end up with parole. That being said, with due process rights, the inmate is entitled to a written decision detailing the reasons for the parole board's decision, either way. So if the parole board decides to grant parole, they have to lay out in writing why. And this is more important if they decide not to grant parole. They have to lay out into writing why. And basically tell the inmate, kind of give them guidance as to what they need to do in order for them to come up for parole again, or next time, what they need to do before then to have a better chance of getting parole, right? Like, we want to see you do this, we want to see you do this, this, this. And sometimes you can go from parole from like 6 months to every 2 years, just depending on the jurisdiction. So, it might get reviewed quite frequently, and they keep track of your progress. But you're entitled to a written decision so that you know what you need to do in order to be successful the next time. Now, that being said, because appointments of parole boards are inherently political, decisions can and often are arbitrary, depending on what they think the public is going to think about them in terms of if they're running for a public office, or the governor has some kind of influence, or what have you. A lot of times they're arbitrary. The parole board doesn't care. They see you did this crime and they're just offended and they don't really care. And sometimes some states use risk assessment tools, right? And basically it's supposed to be this calculation as to if this person is released, what danger do they pose to the community? What danger do they pose to reoffending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, most risk assessment tools have shown very little reliability. So they'll predict one thing, and oftentimes it never happens, or vice versa, right? So they'll let people out who they're like, oh yeah, they don't pose a risk, and they go out and they just offend right away. Or they will not let people out who would not have offended, right? So again, we deal with the risk assessment tools, very little reliability and very arbitrary in decision making. So what we're going to watch here just for a few minutes, we're not going to watch the full thing. I will let you watch the full thing. Is if you want to go to the slides, you can obviously click it. Is 30 years of parole board hearings for Charles Manson. All right. So Charles Manson, basically the leader of a cult, tried to start a race war. His idea was this helter-skelter, goes into a celebrity home, kills well, he doesn't necessarily kill, but he has his brainwashed people go in and kill and make it look like black people came in and murdered this group of affluent, important white people. And it was always a little off his rocker, but you can see what happens as prison changes him. And this actually, it does speak to mental health, right? What mental health in prison is like. So we're only going to watch a couple of minutes of it and then move on. But I encourage you to watch the full thing because it gets really wild, right? You can see him start to deteriorate. And towards the end, you will see that his forehead changes. So I'll give it away now. When he starts his parole board hearings, his forehead is normal. When he's midway to the end of his parole board hearings, suddenly there is a swastika engraved into his forehead. And again, it's very upsetting, but it also shows like what prisons do to mental health. And it doesn't excuse anything he did by any means, but it also shows that you are guaranteed the right to be heard, right? Even if what you're saying is incoherent, it makes no sense, you still have the right to be heard at a parole board hearing. So we will take a look for just a couple of minutes.
I was Judge Older. He was Charles Manson. I'm Judge Older. I'm Tiger Man. In the zoo in San Diego, I ride a motorcycle. I ride a motorcycle in L.A. A bunch of straight Satans call themselves devils, say they're get down, say they got the money over on another edge of town. They got the Beach Boys tied up in their contracts. You can't get into the real estate because Pasadena is a submarine that's run by Jody Hoover, who's over in the chapel, who comes from Colombia with the drug cartel, saying he got money with 2 guns and he taking that pussy. I blew him to hell. It's that simple. Linda Bell.
All right, so someone just shared it and they can't hear it. Let's see. Let's find out why.
The sound is on my end. I can hear it. I don't know about anybody.
Okay, great. Well, then we will continue through.
Ding along, sing along. Mitch Miller, the movies. I'm Bing Crosby, hard as a hobo, loves the Roman fields of clover. I'm Gene Autry. I'm all those guys. I'm in other children. I'm down a wave or 2 up underneath you. What you're doing, you're over flying with the eagles and the fathers of great lands, but I'm king on other wings and baddest motherfucker that ever did live.
I've done the same thing all my life, 24 hours a day, so I'm about 15 Supreme Court judges in my mind. In other words, I know more about law than anybody in the world. I know more about courts and procedures and criminology and penology and procedure than any card sharp dealing doubles off the bench in Monte Carlo. I know more about the economy, more about money, more about the government than any 10 presidents you got. You know, in other words, I've sat in solitary confinement and I watched everything you guys do. And the truth is you're all lying to yourselves. You know?
I'll do whatever I feel is necessary to do whatever I feel is necessary because I believe in George Washington. I believe in the Constitution of George Washington. I believe in the United States government. I don't believe in Abraham Lincoln. I never did. I don't like him at all. That's the truth.
Okay, thank you.
The record is clear that you do have a history of drug usage. I think there's some indication that you use LSD. No drug usage?
I've smoked a little grass and I've taken a little acid, but drugs, no.
Okay.
We don't call them drugs. I mean, you guys call them drugs.
Okay.
You think you'd ever get to know Charlie Manson?
Well, it depends on which one. I have to be a different Charlie Manson for each procedure that I'm in. If I'm under a doctor that gives me medication, I have to be a nice person there to do whatever game he's playing. Mm-hmm. There's a mirror on the wall. And I've been reflecting this thing for 40 years. Mm-hmm.
what the real Charles Manson was what his mother taught him, and I forgot that quite a long time ago.
He also revealed Manson the philosopher, Manson the mystic.
Well, you have certain powers of darkness that you invoke from the mind like a mirror upon the wall. And the power of life and death, or the power to hurt, can be dispensated to the mind throughout the world of darkness.
Well, you see, I live in the underworld. You live in the overworld. I do a lot of things underworld that you guys don't see. Mm-hmm. I made about 75 albums in Vacaville. Mm-hmm. And I bootlegged about 3 times more music than the Beatles put out.
Music?
Yeah. I had the surfboard, the Beach Boys, but I didn't sell it. Because every time I would go to the music, they'd want to change the music. So rather than change the music, I went into the subculture with it. I got an old nuclear submarine that I had from the Navy when I was Section 8 in Leavenworth, Kansas, with Brother Dynamite and the Mafia coming off of Frankie Costello and the horseshoe pits in Pennsylvania in 1952.
Mm-hmm. So we'll say if down the line you were actually given a parole date, what would your plans be?
I would go poof.
Poof?
Poof.
So you really don't have any parole plans?
Well, I don't think parole would be a reasonable perspective. I think I wouldn't take a parole anyway, not really. I'm thinking, you know, I'm here, we're going through the changes of it, but I would like to go back to court. I'd like to get my chance, my day in court. We're based and founded on that. Sooner or later, even if I die tonight, you're still going to have to give me a trial. Sooner or later, that court going to click. And when that big chair clicks, that's going to be right, and I'm going to get my rights.
The turnaround comes to push, push comes to shove. Shove comes to looking around and see where you're up above or down below, where you're at and how it turns. Something that says it's good, says it's bad, that's good, say what it is, that's cool. So when you gets cool, you got some food coming through the door, you don't know what he's doing about what. He just come and fell out of the water like a fish on the floor. And he don't know what he's doing.
We'll stop the video right there for now. But you can see throughout 30 years what kind of toll this takes on a person mentally. Now, Charles Manson obviously had very severe underlying mental health conditions to begin with, but he just, I mean, obviously incoherent ramblings. And the parole board, though, do ask him questions, and they listen to what he has to say, because that is the minimum due process that is afforded to people before the parole board hearings. So, you know, and this is not to laugh at Mr. Manson or anything along those lines, but to be demonstrative of not only public or mental health issues in prison, but also what the prisoner is entitled to say, right? The prisoner is entitled under minimum due process to speak on their own behalf. Now, the parole board can interrupt if they go off for a long time. Charles Manson was obviously a very famous case, very closely watched. So it is a bit different. That being said, I was going to add it to the show, but I'll let you just do it on your own time. I encourage you to watch the O.J. Simpson parole hearings. So O.J. Simpson, obviously, right, was charged with the murder of his ex-wife and her boyfriend. He was found not guilty, even though like he ran for police, and it really divided the country racially. In terms of, because there was a very bad man named Mark Furman who was undoubtedly a racist who planted evidence, right? And that's kind of what threw the case. Now, he gets released. Several years later, he goes into a hotel room in Las Vegas and basically armed robs somebody of what he thinks are his possessions. It's this really kind of weird thing. And he gets sentenced to prison for quite a long time. Um, his first parole board hearing comes up, and he doesn't really apologize, doesn't really like do much talking. But what happens is the victim actually comes in and apologizes to him for having him arrested for doing all this stuff. The victim comes in, and the parole board, despite like OJ being kind of very contemptuous and very, very cocky, they granted parole. All right. Charles Manson was never granted parole. He did die in prison.
You got no
So
idea.
we're talking about conditions of parole. If parole is granted, a series of conditions, as we discussed before, may be imposed within the board's discretion. Now, there's two types of conditions. There are reform conditions and there are control conditions, right? So reform conditions basically are things that urge parolees towards a non-criminal way of life. So this may be, we will let you out on parole, but you have to attend NA, Narcotics Anonymous, right? You have to enroll in a community college. You have to obtain employment. You know, any number of things. The parole board has virtually unlimited number of reform conditions it can impose, right? And the idea is if you don't abide by that, you do not follow through with reform conditions, your parole can be revoked and you can go back to prison. Now, obviously, there's some big issues here, and one of the biggest ones is employment, right? The parole, often a condition of parole is that you become employed. But most places don't want somebody who's on parole or who has even a criminal background to work for them, right? It's even hard in like fast food settings to get a job if you have a criminal record, especially if you're still on parole. Now, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So usually what the parole board does is they understand this, and they require that you turn in so many proof that you've turned in so many applications each week, right? So they say you have to fill out 4 applications each week. And you have to prove that you filled out 4 applications because you can't control whether somebody hires you or not, right? But as long as you're showing proof that you are trying, they're not going to revoke your parole. Right? If you just say, nope, I can't get a job, I'm a felon, then it's over. Then they're going to revoke your parole, right? They're like, you're not trying to reform, you've just given up. And if you've just given up, it's better that you just sit in a cell than potentially endanger the public. So those are reform conditions, again, virtually unlimited. The parole boards can be very, very creative in what they impose. Now, there are some statutory limits, but generally speaking, they have a lot of latitude. Now, they also have control conditions, right? So control conditions basically enable a parole agency to keep track of parolees, right? So control conditions could be you have to check in with your parole officer every 24 hours, right? And if you miss even one check-in, the parole officer or the parole board at the officer's recommendation can revoke your parole, right? And the whole idea here is, yeah, you're still serving some of your sentence, right? Like you're still serving sentence. We get to keep track of you. Now, at this point in time, it's very important to note that as a condition of parole, generally speaking, you've given up your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. So generally speaking, a parole officer, and this is true of probation as well, can come into your home anytime, whenever, with reason, without a reason, search through everything. right? And it happens, right? And if they find something, then you probably are going to get violated, and you're probably going back to prison. So that's kind of the difference, right? Reform is you are doing things to better yourself so that you don't end up back in prison. Control is, look, you're still being punished, and we want to make sure that you stay on the right track and that you don't just skip town and go from there. Now, generally speaking, when you get parole, you are assigned to a parole officer. Now, parole officers are considered quasi-law enforcement, and they have numerous duties. Now, they're quasi-law enforcement. Some states they carry a badge, some states they don't. Most states they are permitted to carry a firearm. At the federal level, that's absolutely true as well. That being said, before we talk about what they actually do, I will say this. If you are interested in law enforcement, or if you're interested in corrections, or if you're interested in anything kind of in that realm, and you don't want to go to law school, which I want you all to go to law school, but I'll take what I can get. If you're in that realm that you're kind of thinking you want to go down this path, becoming a parole officer is, especially at the federal level, the sweetest gig you can imagine, right? So parole officers at the federal level make a ridiculous amount of money. They generally have small caseloads, and unlike at the state level, let's say a parolee skips town, doesn't check in. The parole officer, it's not their job to go find him. The parole officer just goes next door to the U.S. Marshals, says, need you to find this guy, arrest him, bring him in. And then it's the U.S. Marshals' job to go deal with it. Right? So parole officers at the federal level get paid a lot of money. They generally aren't dealing with dangerous offenders. And if the offender runs, doesn't abide by their control conditions or reform conditions, they don't even make the arrest. They go send the U.S. Marshals, right, to do it for them. So it is a very cushy job. It's a hard one to get, but it is very, pays very well, full federal benefits. It's a really, really, really good job. At the state level, it's still pretty good. It's not as cushy because generally speaking, state level, it's up to you as the parole officer to track this person down if they run, right? You don't have the U.S. Marshals or a state equivalent. You're also probably dealing with more violent offenders. It's still going to be drugs, right, for the most part, but you're dealing with violent offenders more frequently. So there is an element of danger there. But again, the way parole systems are set up and probation and parole are established, it still is a pretty decent job at the state level. It does pay very well. You do have state pensions, state benefits, etc. So it's something to consider. And I know a lot of people who are thinking criminal justice or they're thinking law enforcement, they don't consider parole officer, but it is a very good gig if you can get it. So that being said, what does a parole officer do? Right. So again, they're quasi-law enforcement. They have numerous duties. So they call them clients, but they're offenders, right? So their first job is to supervise clients, right? So to make sure that the client is abiding by the conditions of their parole. Theoretically, and I say this theoretically, is they are supposed to aid their client in resolving problems, right? So they almost kind of act as a therapist in some regards, in terms of this person is having a dispute with their landlord, and one of their things of their condition for their release is that they maintain their maintain an apartment, and it looks like they might lose it, and they work with theoretically the parole officer works with the client to kind of come up with a plan, and also say, well, you're honest with me, like, I understand what's going on, you won't be violated if this happens, but we have to continue working together to make sure that we resolve this. To that end, they're also responsible for policing clients, right? So again, this kind of goes back to ensuring they're doing what they're supposed to do. And if they are not, this means recommending or violating them, or recommending a violation from the parole boards or from the courts. This includes everything from random drug tests, random searches of their home, whatever, to make sure that they are not reoffending, right? So they police their clients in that regard. Now, generally speaking, if they go to somebody's house to search it, they're going to bring traditional law enforcement with them in order to protect safety and everything else, right? They're not just going to risk it. And there are parole officers and parolees who do form a very good relationship. The parole officer can never assume and will often, the parolee will often try to dupe the probation officer or parole officer. So you can't ever assume, like, you can't be friends, you can't cross that threshold, but some you have a natural rapport with, like, if you are legitimately trying, the parole officer is going to probably do everything they can to help you. But if you are just like doing the bare minimums, you don't care, like you haven't reformed, whatever, that parole officer is going to be on top of you, waiting to violate you as soon as they possibly can. And theoretically, and this is very theoretically, they are supposed to act as a counselor, right? So the parole officer is supposed to help easing reentry into the community, right? So you leave prison and you basically don't have anything. The parole officer is supposed to be there to help you and give you guidance, give you support in terms of turning your life around and getting established in the community again and all that jazz. Now, this happens definitely more at the federal level, but even then, it doesn't really happen that often. It's just like, this one's really kind of parole officer by parole officer, right? How they approach their duties, how they interact with their clients, etc. So theoretically, they're supposed to help ease reentry into society. They're not just there to like punish and jump on them. They're also there to like help them. Again, this really is dependent upon whom the parole officer is. Talk a minute about parole violations and revocations, right? So often, given the number of practically of conditions imposed by parole boards, parole violations are common, right? So statistically speaking, 1/3 of all incoming prisoners are incarcerated for parole violations, right? So people coming into prison, 1/3 of them are there for parole violations. And it's because the number of restrictions or how impractical the restrictions are on a person, it's setting them up to fail. So what happens when there's a violation that's alleged? Well, the violation is alleged. The parolee is again afforded minimum due process, but there are due process, specifically due process rights. This includes an initial informal hearing to determine whether there is probable cause to forward the alleged violation to the parole board, right? So this is an informal hearing. This is not necessarily even the same as when we discussed things like arraignments and things along those lines. This is just, is it more likely than not that you violated a condition of your parole? If it is, then we send it to the parole board. If it's not, then you just go back on your way. But we're virtually always going to find that there is probable cause to believe that somebody violated the parole conditions. So then it moves to a revocation hearing, right? So if we find probable cause, then you go to a revocation hearing. This is held by the parole board, in which due process requires actually several things. First, you have to be given written notice of the alleged violation. Disclosure of evidence against the parolee. So you have to, if the state has to turn over their evidence as to the parolee in terms of their violation and what people have said and things like that. The parolee has the opportunity to be heard and to present witnesses, right? So they can bring in their own evidence. They don't just have to fight the state's evidence, they can bring in their own. They have the right to cross-examine a witness unless it's otherwise waived by the board, right? So this might be like a child is a witness and the prisoner wants to cross-examine them and they don't have an attorney or anything like that. Like the parole board might say, yeah, no, we're not allowing this. And then they are provided upon the determination of the parole board, written notice of the decision and written notice of the facts relied upon. The idea here is that then you could theoretically appeal that decision. So when we talk about full release supervision, changing from parole to probation, whether a prisoner's incarceration term or parole term has been fulfilled, they will likely also be on probation for several years, right? So in other words, not only can probation be imposed in lieu of imprisonment, as previously discussed, it can also be imposed following a term of imprisonment. Right, so this is very common, as I said before, in the federal system. The federal level, a lot of charges carry a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison. So you might get 5 years in prison, followed by 5 years, even to life, on probation, right? The idea here is you get 5 years imprisonment, obviously serve 85%, assuming you're good, you get released, you are on probation until the end of your term, and then once you're off probation, you're done with the system, right? But it's a lot more difficult than that. Oftentimes, I mean, people violate like crazy, right? Oftentimes it's 5 years imprisonment followed by 5 years up to life on probation. So under this federal sentencing scheme, judges have much more discretion in the length and terms of probation than they do incarceration. So most federal offenses carry between 5 years to life on probation, right? So this is up to the judge. The judge has a lot of discretion here. So in terms of incarceration, they generally have to follow a set pattern and rules. But when it comes to probation, it's really up to them. So they could sentence somebody to life on probation, and anytime you messed up, you go right back to prison. That is definitely extreme and doesn't occur that often, but it does happen. Most of the time, it's going to be the lower end of the scale, 5 years. Now, similar to parole, conditions may be strict, and we suspend some constitutional rights. Again, probable cause for a search. We can search anytime for any reason or no reason whatsoever. When we talk about disparities in post-trial release and probation, the success of post-release probationers is largely dependent upon their respective officers and resources, right? So at the state level, probation often deals with pretrial release, probation in lieu of prison, probation following release, and sometimes parole, right? So a parole and probation officer can be the same thing, especially at the state level, right? Because they basically have the same kind of workload. At the federal level, probation just focuses on probation in lieu of imprisonment and probation following release. It's important to note that at the federal level, they have a very specially funded program called pretrial services. Now, what's great about it is if you are charged with a federal crime, the judge can impose certain requirements, even if you haven't been found guilty yet. The judge can impose certain requirements, or you can ask for certain things, and they will be given to you for free. So if you want counseling, again, if you're like, and again, this is often happens, especially in sex cases. They're going to order you to, as a part of your pretrial, go to counseling. And anything you say to your counselor can't be shared necessarily with the court or anything like that. All the counselor can do is say that, yes, you've been coming, but you don't pay for it at the federal level. The feds pay for it, right? You might go to detox. The feds pay for it. You might start an employment program. You might start an education program. The feds pay for it. At the state level, not so much. Anything that happens at the state level basically comes out of your own pocket, right? So again, ever get the opportunity, opportunity is not the right word. If you are ever given if you commit a crime and you are given a chance to go federal or go state, and again, it's never up to you, but if you are, always go federal, right? Again, we talked about the prisons are much safer and whatnot, but again, they give you these great resources. In addition, when you are in probation, following your sentence, the feds will still pay for you to go to counseling. The feds will still pay for it as long as you're under their auspice, as long as that you're under their thumb to some degree, they will pay for it, right? And it's much more successful at the federal level than it is at the state level. Now, that being said, regarding probation officers, right, different than parole, but maybe they're the same, they have a considerable amount of discretion as well in handling violations of probation. So oftentimes they can cite the probationer, right? So they can just basically give them a slap on the wrist, don't do it again. They can engage in more intensive counseling. So now you have to come check in with me 2 times a day. Or they might not choose to respond at all, because only the court can revoke probation, and they can only do it on a preponderance of the evidence, right? So a probation officer can recommend revocation, or a probation officer can say, no, there's no reason to take this to court, right? Like there's not enough here. It's ridiculous. Now, ideally, probation officers and parole officers would support the prisoner and facilitate a successful reentry into the community. But, and this is a big but, that very rarely, if ever, happens. So I encourage you to go in and watch this video on the PowerPoint. It's about 18 minutes long, but it really deals with the unbelievable obstacles to reentry, including probation and parole officers who aren't necessarily supported as they're supposed to be. So that being said, next class, we're looking at the ultimate punishment, the death penalty. Thank you for listening, and as always, if you have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to email me.